Hey everyone, before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time you're watching. It really helps YouTube keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I grew up near farmland that stretched out further than my eyes could ever see. When I was a kid, the sound of crickets at night was like a lullaby, steady and constant, filling every corner of the air. The fields always made noise, even when the wind was still. Frogs croaked near the ditches, coyotes yipped far off, insects hummed, and the stalks of corn rustled against each other whenever the night breeze touched them. It never truly went quiet out there, not until one summer when I learned just how wrong silence could feel in a place that was supposed to be alive. That summer, I was staying at my uncle's place. He owned several acres of farmland, most of it corn and wheat, with a rundown barn on the edge of the property. He was away for a few weeks, and I was tasked with keeping an eye on things, feeding the dogs, checking on the fences, and just making sure nobody messed with his equipment. It was an easy job, and I liked the peace of being out there. The house sat back from the road with the fields rolling out behind it, stretching flat and empty until the tree line swallowed the horizon. The days were hot, the kind of sticky heat that made your shirt cling to your back before you'd even walked 100 yards. The nights, though, were bearable. I would sit out on the porch once the sun went down, drinking water or cheap beer, letting the sound of the fields keep me company. That was what felt strange when I noticed it, the quiet. It wasn't sudden, not like flipping a switch. It was more like the noise drained away slowly, little by little, until I realized I was sitting in total silence. No crickets, no wind, not even the low buzz of flies that always seemed to hang around. The fields were silent. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a shift in the weather. Maybe the bugs just settled down all at once. But deep inside, my body reacted before my mind did. My skin prickled and every hair on my arm stood up. It was around 11 when I noticed it that first night. I checked the sky, looking for storm clouds, thinking maybe the animals had sensed something coming. The stars were out, scattered and clear, no sign of rain. I sat there a little longer, uneasy, then finally went inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was nothing. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I had imagined it. The next night, the same thing happened, but this time I paid closer attention. Around midnight, the noise faded until there was nothing left. The silence stretched so far that I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy and thick in my ears. I stood on the porch, staring at the endless rows of corn, the stalks dark and unmoving, as if the entire field was holding its breath. My body was tense, waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. The silence lasted maybe half an hour before the sounds came back. First a few crickets, then more, until the night returned to normal. I went back inside, my throat dry, and stayed up until dawn. By the third night, I was already dreading it. I told myself I wouldn't go out onto the porch again, but when the clock crept toward midnight, I found myself standing at the screen door, staring out into the darkness. And again it happened. The silence rolled in, thick and heavy, covering everything. This time, though, I caught something else. A faint sound, distant but sharp against the emptiness. It was the sound of footsteps. Not the steady padding of an animal, not the quick flutter of something small. These were heavy, uneven steps moving slow, somewhere out in the rows of corn. I froze, straining my ears. The steps would pause, then start again, dragging and crunching against the dry dirt paths between the stalks. I stood there so long my legs started to hurt. I wanted to grab a flashlight to shine it out there and see what was moving, but something in me resisted. It wasn't fear of what I might not see. It was fear of what I might actually catch sight of. The silence stretched on and the footsteps eventually faded, swallowed back into nothing. When the noise of the crickets finally returned, I shut the door, locked every window, and sat in the living room with every light on until morning. My nerves were shot, and every creak of the house made me flinch. The next day, I checked the edges of the field. I walked the dirt paths where the rows opened up and looked for footprints. The ground was dry and hard, not easy for tracks to stick, but I thought I saw faint impressions, long, narrow prints, deeper on one side like someone had been limping. I told myself it could have been a farmhand passing through, maybe even a neighbor's kid messing around. Still, the thought of someone out there in the middle of the night moving through the fields unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. That night I stayed inside, but the silence came again. Midnight, right on the mark. The sound drained away and then came the footsteps. This time they were closer. I was upstairs sitting by the window, and I could hear them more clearly, slow, dragging, almost deliberate. My chest tightened as I realized the sound was moving toward the house. I couldn't see anything from the window, not with how tall the corn had grown, but I could hear it. Step by step, closer and closer, until I swore it was just outside the yard. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow, and waited. Then nothing. The steps stopped. For what felt like an hour, I stood there in the dark, listening to silence. When the crickets finally started again, it was almost worse because it meant whatever had been out there had blended back into the night. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I considered calling someone, maybe even driving back to town, but I kept thinking about my uncle's dogs. They were big animals kept in a fenced pen by the barn. If someone was creeping around the property, the dogs would bark like crazy. Except they hadn't, not once. That night I tested it. I sat out by the barn as the sun went down, listening to the dogs breathing, shifting around, occasionally growling at shadows. But when midnight came and the silence swept in, they went quiet. Not a whine, not a bark. They lay flat against the ground, ears pinned back, their bodies stiff with fear. They knew that was the worst part. They knew before I did. The footsteps came again, louder this time, circling. I sat in the barn with the dogs, clutching a heavy wrench like it would make a difference. My throat burned from breathing so fast, but I didn't move. I heard the steps crunch past the barn, slow and steady, pausing every few feet like whoever it was listening, waiting. At one point, the steps stopped right outside the barn doors. I could see the shadows shifting under the crack, something tall enough to block out the thin line of moonlight. My chest ached from holding my breath. The dogs didn't make a sound. Then, slowly, the steps moved away, fading into the rows again. When the sounds of the night finally came back, I almost collapsed. By then, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Someone was out there, night after night, waiting for midnight to move closer and closer. I forced myself to go out during the day, checking the fields deeper this time. The corn rustled dryly as I pushed through, sweat stinging my eyes. 100 yards in, I found something that made my stomach drop. Between two rows, there was a small patch of flattened stalks, a place where someone had been lying down. The dirt was pressed smooth, and in the middle was a crushed beer can, old and rusted. Whoever it was had been staying out there, waiting in silence until the time was right to move. I stood there staring at it, realizing how close I had been every night to someone who had been watching the house. Not an animal, not a neighbor. Person that night, I didn't sit inside. I waited with the shotgun my uncle kept in the closet. Midnight came, and with it, the silence. The air grew thick again, the sound bleeding away, and then the steps started. This time I was ready. I kept still, the gun across my lap, eyes fixed on the yard. The steps came closer, dragging through the dirt, crunching the dry leaves, circling just outside the house. My pulse hammered so hard I thought I might faint. Then I saw it. A shadow passed between the corn and the yard. Tall, moving slow, pausing at the edge like it was testing me. I couldn't make out a face, only the outline of a figure, long arms hanging low, head tilted. It didn't move for what felt like forever. Then it took one more step forward. I raised the shotgun and cocked it. The sound broke the silence like glass shattering. And just like that, the shadow was gone. No running, no crashing through the stalks, just gone. I stayed there all night, gripping the gun until my hands ached, waiting for the silence to lift. When the crickets came back, I knew it was over. At least until the next night. I left the next morning. I didn't care about the dogs or the house. I locked up, drove into town, and refused to go back alone. When my uncle returned, I told him everything. He didn't laugh, didn't call me paranoid. He just nodded slowly, his face pale, and said the same thing had happened to him years ago. He never figured out who it was or why they only came when the fields went silent. But he never stayed there alone again either. To this day, I can't stand silence at night. If the crickets stop, if the world goes still, I feel that same prickling crawl over my skin. I think about those footsteps, slow and steady, always circling, always waiting for midnight. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made a sound. If I had just sat there in the quiet, letting them take that one more step closer. I grew up around farmland, the kind of land that stretched for miles with nothing but flat earth, dry dirt roads, and the kind of tall grass that moved like waves when the wind cut across it. It was quiet most of the time, so quiet you could hear the insects buzzing at night like a steady hum. People who weren't from around there often said the fields felt eerie, but to me, they were normal. I had walked them countless times in the daytime, worked through them, driven tractors and hauled equipment through them, and I knew the layout well enough to walk blindfolded. But everything that feels safe under the sun changes once darkness settles, and I learned that one night in a way I still can't forget. It was late summer, a little before harvest, and the corn had grown tall and heavy. The stalks were high enough that if you stood in the middle, you couldn't see out at all. They formed a wall on every side, and once the wind stilled, the whole place would go dead quiet, like the world had paused. I had been helping a neighbor who owned a big piece of land about 2 miles down from our property. He needed help fixing a piece of irrigation pipe that had cracked, and I stayed later than I planned. By the time I got done and packed my things, the sun had already dropped low, painting the fields in red and orange light. The silence of the evening was so thick it felt like it pressed on my ears. I remember thinking I should hurry because walking back home meant cutting across part of the cornfields, and I didn't want to do it in the dark. Still, I wasn't worried yet. The path was one I knew, a straight line for the most part, with only a couple turns near the old windmill that sat rusted and broken. I carried a flashlight, but its beam was weak, and the batteries had been fading for weeks. I told myself it would last long enough to get me across. By the time I reached the field's edge, night had settled completely. No moon, no stars, just thick clouds rolling overhead. The field was still, the kind of stillness that makes your own breathing sound too loud. I clicked on my flashlight, and the circle of dull yellow light barely cut through the dark. The rows of corn towered on both sides as soon as I stepped in, and I felt the temperature drop. It always got colder in the cornfields at night, like the stalks held the day's shadows in them. The first half-mile went fine. My boots crunched the dry soil, the flashlight beam bounced ahead, and I kept my pace steady. Every now and then I would hear something small shift in the stalks, mice, maybe a rabbit. Normal sounds, but after a while the noises stopped. It was as if everything that usually moved in the dark had disappeared. The silence was total. That was the first moment I felt the unease. When silence stretches too long, your mind starts creating sounds. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, light and slow, but when I stopped, there was nothing. Just the faint rustle of dry leaves when the wind pushed through. I kept moving, telling myself it was nerves. The field at night always played tricks. The second time I heard it, the sound was clearer. It wasn't my footsteps because the timing was wrong. Mine were steady, and these came half a beat after, like someone pacing me but keeping distance. I swung my flashlight behind me, but the weak beam showed nothing but endless rows of corn. The stalks leaned and bent with the light, shadows stretching long and crooked. I thought about calling out, but the sound caught in my throat. If it was just nerves, I would feel foolish. If it wasn't, then I wasn't sure I wanted to draw attention to myself. I kept walking, faster now, my hands sweating against the flashlight handle. My boots struck harder against the soil, and the echoes of the other steps seemed to quicken too, though I couldn't be sure anymore if they were real or if my own pace was confusing me. Halfway across the field, the flashlight flickered. My chest tightened. I smacked it with my palm, and the light steadied for a few more minutes before dimming again. The darkness between the rows deepened. The corn swayed slightly, though there was no wind. That was when the silence broke. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A low crunch like weight shifting on dirt coming from the right side, 2 rows away. I froze. The noise stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. The blood pounding so hard in my head it made its own dull roar. For a long stretch, nothing happened. Then another crunch, closer this time. I couldn't see anything. The flashlight was too weak. The stalks were too thick. But I knew something was in there. The feeling in my gut was sharp and certain. The kind of instinct you don't argue with. Someone was out there, keeping pace with me, hidden in the corn. I moved again. Faster than before, nearly jogging now, trying not to let my breathing get too loud. The sound followed, steady, not rushing, just keeping up. That scared me more than anything. It wasn't an animal. Animals bolt. They scatter. They don't pace a person for half a mile in silence. I turned sharply at the old windmill, my boots slipping on the dirt. My light swung wide, and for a split second I thought I saw something between the stalks. A darker shape in the dark. Tall, upright. Then it was gone. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it hurt. The last stretch felt endless. My flashlight flickered until it finally died, leaving me in pure blackness. I tried to keep to the center of the row, running now, hands brushing stalks on either side to keep balance. Behind me I could hear it, no longer trying to stay quiet. Footsteps, heavy now, breaking stalks, closing in. I burst out of the field at last, stumbling into the open dirt road that ran along its edge. I turned, gasping, straining my eyes against the dark wall of corn. Nothing moved. The silence fell again, deeper than before. My legs shook so bad I could hardly stand, and I forced myself to keep moving toward home, never looking away from the rows until they were far behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me tense. I thought about what I had heard, about the shape I thought I saw and the way it never rushed me, only followed. It hadn't been random. It was deliberate. The next morning, I went back with daylight on my side. I told myself I needed to prove it had been my imagination. The field looked normal at first, quiet and empty. But then I saw them, footprints, not mine. Not animal, human. They trailed through the rows, pacing alongside the very path I had taken, keeping perfect distance the whole way. At the corner near the windmill, they stopped. The soil there was scuffed, as if someone had stood waiting, watching. I never crossed that field at night again. I don't know who it was or why they were out there, but I know they were real. The silence of the fields at night was no longer just eerie to me. It was dangerous, because in that silence you could hear everything, and if you weren't alone, you'd know it. From then on, I understood something that I can't forget. The fields are silent until midnight, but silence doesn't mean empty. Sometimes it just means someone else is already there waiting. And that night, someone was waiting for me. I grew up around open land. Fields stretched in every direction. Some planted with crops, others left overgrown, filled with tall grass that swayed in the wind like restless water. Most of my childhood memories were tied to those fields, from running through them in the summer to walking along the edges in the cold fall evenings. They had always been silent places, especially at night. You'd hear the wind, maybe crickets, maybe the low croak of frogs in wetter patches. But the deeper you went into them, the quieter everything seemed to become. It was a kind of silence that had always unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. It was different from the quiet of a room, or the silence of being alone in a house. This was a heavy silence, something that felt like it pressed against your skin, as if the land itself wanted you to know you weren't supposed to linger there for too long. That silence was on my mind, the night everything changed. I had decided to spend a weekend alone out in the countryside, staying at an old family cabin that hadn't been used in a long time. It was on the edge of the fields, a small wooden structure built decades ago when my grandfather still worked the land. The roof sagged in places, the wood had darkened with age, but it was still solid enough to spend the night. I brought with me a sleeping bag, some food, water, a flashlight, and a small hunting knife. Nothing fancy, just something to feel safe with. I told myself it was just another weekend away from people, a chance to clear my head. The first day passed quietly. I walked the perimeter of the property, checked the fences that leaned and bowed under their own weight, and wandered down into the fields. The stalks were tall that season, dry and brittle, clattering against each other when the wind passed through. I lost track of time out there, walking the narrow animal paths that cut through the growth, noticing broken stems where deer had pushed their way through, and patches of flattened grass where something had bedded down. It was the kind of place where the more you looked, the more you realized how much life existed unseen. Tracks dropping, signs of digging. You never saw the animals themselves, but you knew they were around you. By dusk, I was back at the cabin. The air cooled fast once the sun went down, and I lit a small fire outside, more for comfort than warmth. I ate canned food straight from the tin, sitting on an old wooden crate. The fields around me darkened until they were only shapes against the sky, black and endless. The stars came out sharp and bright, and the silence deepened the later it grew. It was the kind of silence where your own breathing sounded too loud, where even shifting on the crate made me feel like I was breaking some unspoken rule. I went inside before long, unrolled my sleeping bag and tried to settle in. The floor creaked under me, the old boards groaning as if they resented the weight. I left the flashlight beside me, turned off, and listened to the night. At first there was nothing unusual, just the silence. But the longer I lay there, the more I realized the silence wasn't as complete as I thought. There was something faint carried on the wind, something distant. I told myself it was just a trick of my ears. Maybe the sound of branches rubbing together, maybe a night bird. But it didn't go away. It was a low, irregular sound. A shuffle, then a pause. Another shuffle, then stillness, like footsteps dragging through grass. It was faint but steady enough to notice. I held my breath and tried to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to come from the fields, not close, not far either. Just out there, moving slow. I strained to hear more, but after a while it stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours before sleep finally took me. The next morning I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe. Something wandering at night. Nothing unusual. I went about the day as planned, walking the fields again, climbing up a low ridge that gave me a view across the land. From up there, the cabin looked like a tiny toy set against the sea of crops. The fields stretched far beyond, merging into dark green tree lines in the distance. It all looked so peaceful from that height that I almost laughed at myself for feeling unsettled the night before. But that second night was different. I sat by the fire again, but I couldn't relax the way I had before. I kept looking out at the fields, waiting for the silence to thicken. When I finally went inside and lay down, I didn't let myself drift so easily. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, the sound came again. This time it was clearer. The shuffling, slow steps dragging through the stalks. A pause, another shuffle. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just one source. It was more than one, several, moving unevenly. Some closer, some farther. I pushed myself up, heart pounding, and held the knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to give myself away. The steps went on for minutes, then stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I sat in the dark, muscles stiff, barely daring to breathe. At some point, I must have drifted into shallow sleep, because when I opened my eyes again, the sun was rising. The sounds of birds finally returning to the land. I didn't want to stay another night, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had food, water, shelter, and nothing bad had actually happened. Leaving early felt foolish, so I stayed, though the day crawled by with an uneasy weight pressing down on me. That night I decided I wouldn't just lie there waiting. I would stay awake, ready. I kept the flashlight in my hand, knife on my lap, and leaned against the wall, eyes on the window. The fields were still black and endless. The silence stretched. My ears rang with it. And then, just as the clock on my phone hit midnight, the fields woke up. The sound was immediate. Shuffling steps, many of them, moving at once. Not rushed, not panicked. Slow, purposeful. They dragged through the stalks, snapping stems under weight. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it out the window. The beam cut across the edge of the field, but nothing moved in sight. Still, the sounds went on. My pulse hammered in my ears. I killed the light and crouched lower, peering through the cracks in the boards. The steps circled the cabin, always just beyond sight, just out of reach. They dragged and paused like they were waiting for something. Hours passed that way. By the time the sounds faded, my nerves were shot. I never slept. When dawn broke, I stepped outside, exhausted but determined to see proof. I walked the edge of the field, scanning the ground. That was when I found them. Tracks, not clear footprints, not crisp enough to identify, but impressions in the soil pressed deep. Too large to be deer, too heavy to be anything I could explain away. They went in a rough circle around the cabin, stopping and starting at odd points. The grass was crushed where something had stood still for long stretches, facing the cabin, watching. That was enough for me. I packed my things, loaded my bag, and started walking toward the dirt road that led back to town. But as I crossed the fields, weaving through the stalks, I noticed something worse. More tracks. Not just around the cabin. They were everywhere. Paths worn through the crops, wide enough for several bodies moving side by side. Some fresh, some older, but all leading to and from the same direction. Deeper into the fields, toward the far tree line. I didn't want to know what was out there. I didn't care. I kept walking fast as I could without breaking into a run. The sun was high, the day was bright, but the silence was still heavy, as if the land itself held its breath. When I finally reached the road and saw the faint outline of the highway beyond, I felt a rush of relief that almost made me dizzy. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine roaring, dirt kicking up behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself it wasn't worth figuring out what had made those tracks, what had walked the fields in the dead of night. The land had kept its silence during the day. But at midnight it came alive with something I didn't understand. And I wasn't going to give it another chance to surround me, even now. Years later, I sometimes dream about it. I'll wake in the dark, certain I can hear the slow drag of steps through dry grass, circling, waiting. I'll hold my breath, waiting for silence to swallow me whole. And when I finally breathe again, I remind myself that the fields may still be silent, but only until midnight. I grew up around farmland, but I was never much of a farmer. My uncle owned hundreds of acres of corn and wheat fields, and as a kid I had spent summers helping with small chores, stacking bales, pulling weeds, riding in the back of trucks, but I never paid attention to the bigger picture. Years later, I found myself renting a small house out in the country, miles from town, and the only thing around me, for as far as I could see, were empty fields. Most of them were owned by different families. Some worked, some left fallow, but all of them spread out like a sea of flat land with the horizon drawn low and wide. I thought the quiet would be good for me. I told myself I liked it. I liked the isolation, the space, the open air. At night, though, it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears, heavy like the land was holding its breath. No cars, no voices, no movement except maybe the distant hum of a transformer on a pole, or the whistle of wind brushing through rows of dry stalks. It was beautiful at first, peaceful, but after a while it started to feel like something else. Like the land didn't just rest at night, it waited. One particular evening in late September, I sat outside on my porch with a mug of coffee. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the sky was clear with a bright half-moon hanging low. The fields around me looked pale in the moonlight, like endless sheets of silver broken by black lines of fence posts. There was no sound at all except crickets hidden deep in the weeds. But even they seemed scattered and weak, as if they too were holding back their noise. I noticed then how still the fields were. Not just quiet, but empty. Too empty. I had gotten used to hearing coyotes at night, the yips and calls that usually carried across the land after dark. I had gotten used to owls and the odd rustle of deer moving through the brush. That night there was nothing. The fields were silent. I shrugged it off, but it stuck with me. I kept staring at those empty stretches of land, wondering why they seemed so bare. I reminded myself that animals don't keep schedules. They move where they want, when they want. It was just chance, but I still felt the silence pushing in. By midnight, I was still outside, and I realized I was waiting for something. My eyes scanned the rows of corn across the road. They had grown tall and thick through the summer, but by now the leaves were brown and brittle, the ears heavy and bent. The wind should have been rattling them, but the air had gone still. The fields looked frozen. Then, just as the clock on my phone rolled past 12, the silence broke. It started faint, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along dirt. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears. It came again, a steady scrape. Then another, slow, uneven. I leaned forward, gripping the porch railing, eyes locked on the cornfield across the way. The sound grew clearer, and with it came another, like soft thuds of footsteps, but not light ones. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through dry stalks. I told myself it was deer. That's all it could be. But the scrape didn't fit. The scrape was something else, like metal or wood being pulled. I couldn't see anything moving, though. The moonlight touched the tops of the stalks, but beneath them was shadow. My chest felt tight. I stood there listening, unable to move until the sounds faded. Silence returned just as suddenly as it had broken. I went inside then, locking the door, telling myself over and over it was nothing, just animals. I slept badly, waking every hour, ears searching for that sound again. By morning, the fields looked harmless in the sunlight, ordinary and empty. I laughed at myself for getting spooked, but the next night it happened again. Same silence, same sudden change at midnight, same dragging noise, slow and patient, followed by the crunch of steps. This time I grabbed a flashlight and stood at the edge of my yard, beam sweeping the road and the start of the corn rows. Nothing, just shadows and dry leaves. The noises kept going, deep in the field, hidden. When I shined the light, they stopped. When I turned it off, they started again. Always just far enough I couldn't see. That became a pattern. Every night that week, the fields were silent until midnight. Then the noises began. Always around the same time, always the same dragging scrape and heavy steps. I stopped sitting outside after a while. I sat inside, lights off, staring through the window. I never saw anything move, but I felt it. Something was out there. Something that only came when the clock crossed 12. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what could I say? That the cornfield made noises at night? They would laugh me out of the county. I thought about walking into the field during the day, checking for tracks or signs. But each morning I found reasons not to. Work, errands, excuses. Truth was, I didn't want to see what was there. One night I forced myself. I told myself I'd prove it was nothing. I stayed up until midnight, heard the sounds start again, then slipped on boots, grabbed a flashlight and a small kitchen knife, and walked across the gravel road to the edge of the corn. The rows loomed tall, dry leaves crackling faintly in the breeze. My light cut into them, revealing only narrow tunnels of stalks and shadows. The noise had stopped the moment I crossed the road. I stood there, sweating in the cold, heart pounding. The knife shook in my hand. I whispered to myself, though no words came out loud. Then I stepped in. The corn closed around me. The rows swallowed the moonlight. The smell of dry husks filled my nose. I pushed forward slowly, flashlight beam cutting across brown stalks, ears dangling. Every step sounded like thunder in that silence. I kept telling myself I'd go 20 feet, then turn back. Just 20. Just enough to prove it was empty. At 10 feet in, I heard it again. The dragging. But not ahead. Behind, back toward the road, slow, scrape, pause, scrape. My mouth went dry. I swung the light back, but all I saw were stalks trembling in the breeze. The noise stopped with the light. I held it there for what felt like minutes, then slowly turned back forward. When I took another step, the dragging sound started again. Closer now. I turned and ran. Stalks slapped my face, cracked under my boots. I burst out of the field, gasping, nearly tripping on the ditch, and sprinted back across the road. I didn't stop until I was on my porch, door locked behind me, back pressed to the wall. After that night, I didn't go near the fields again. I tried to ignore the noises, bury myself in work, sleep with headphones. But it got worse. The dragging started lasting longer. The footsteps grew louder. I swore I could hear breathing some nights, slow and wet. And always, it started at midnight sharp. One night I woke to find the sounds weren't in the field anymore. They were closer, in the ditch by the road, right outside my house. Heavy steps moving slow across gravel, something dragging along with them. I lay frozen in bed, listening, hardly daring to breathe. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't make myself move. Eventually, the noises faded again. The next morning, I found marks in the dirt by the road. Long, shallow grooves cutting through gravel, as if something heavy had been pulled along. Beside them were footprints. Not boots, not bare feet, but shoes. Ordinary shoes. Size of a man. I moved out a week later. Packed everything I owned in 2 days, left furniture behind, didn't tell anyone why. The landlord didn't ask. I didn't care if I lost money. I couldn't stay. Months have passed since then. I live in town now, in a small apartment above a store. Cars outside all night, people shouting, dogs barking. The noise is constant. I love it. I need it. But sometimes, late at night when everything pauses for just a moment, I hear silence creep back in. And I remember those fields. I remember how they held their breath until midnight. And I remember what broke the silence when the clock turned 12. I don't go back there. I never will. Because I know now that whatever was out in those fields was not some animal. It was someone. And I don't want to know who. I grew up around farmland, and the silence of wide fields never bothered me. I had walked through them countless times. At dawn when the air was damp and heavy with mist, and at dusk when the sun bled across the horizon, soaking the rows of crops in orange light. I had always thought of the fields as harmless, just wide open stretches of dirt and plants. Nothing to fear. But the night I decided to stay out there alone until midnight changed that forever. It started with curiosity. For weeks, I had heard talk from some of the older men in town, men who spent their lives tending corn and wheat, that nothing good came from staying in the fields past midnight. They never explained why, just shook their heads, muttered that the ground had a way of holding secrets. Most of them dismissed it as old farmers' talk, but something about the way their eyes hardened when they said it made me wonder. I had always brushed off their words, but the idea stayed in my mind, a little itch I couldn't stop scratching. One evening I decided I would test it myself. I told no one where I was going. I packed a small flashlight, a knife I used for camping, a bottle of water, and a thin blanket. I walked out past the last line of houses, following the dirt road until I reached the fields that spread endlessly under the fading sky. The air was cooler than it had been during the day, carrying the faint smell of tilled soil and dry grass. The sky dimmed quickly, stars slowly waking one by one. The field I chose was wide and flat, rows of corn stretching far into the darkness. I set myself down near the edge at first, not ready to wander too deep just yet. The blanket barely softened the hard ground, and the flashlight beam was sharp and narrow, slicing only a few feet into the rows. At first, everything felt calm. I heard the usual nighttime sounds, crickets buzzing, a soft wind moving the stalks, the occasional call of a distant owl. For hours, nothing changed. The world around me was quiet, almost too quiet. I had expected to hear some kind of movement, maybe animals scurrying through the corn, but it was strangely still. Even the bugs seemed to quiet down more than usual. I checked the time on my phone. 11:55. My chest tightened as I realized midnight was only minutes away. I told myself I was being stupid, that nothing would happen, that it was just an empty field. The first thing I noticed was the change in the air. Just before the clock ticked past midnight, the wind that had been moving gently through the corn died completely. The stalks no longer rustled. Everything was still, too still, as if the entire field was holding its breath. I sat upright, gripping my flashlight tighter, my ears straining for any sound. When the clock on my phone turned to 12, I heard it. It wasn't loud. At first, it was just a faint shuffle, like someone dragging their feet slowly across the dirt. It came from deep within the field, far enough away that I couldn't see anything, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. My skin prickled. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog, but the steps were too steady, too deliberate. They stopped for a few seconds, then started again, each one slow and heavy. I turned off my flashlight, afraid the beam would give me away. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The stars above were faint and distant, and the moon was hidden behind a thin layer of clouds. Leaving me in dim, grainy blackness, I sat frozen, every muscle tense, listening as the footsteps grew closer. Then they stopped. The silence pressed down on me harder than before. I waited, holding my breath, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I scanned the rows of corn, searching for movement, but the tall stalks swayed so slightly in the night air that it was impossible to tell if anything was out there. I thought about leaving, but I couldn't bring myself to stand up. Not yet. When the sound came again, it wasn't footsteps this time. It was something softer, harder to place. A slow, steady scraping, like metal dragging against stone, started far off and grew louder, echoing faintly in the open space of the field. My stomach sank. That wasn't the sound of any animal. I gripped the knife I had brought, though the small blade felt useless against whatever was making that noise. The scraping stopped suddenly, and the silence returned. My ears rang with the weight of it. I sat there, clutching the knife, straining my eyes against the darkness. Then I noticed something that made my chest go cold. The rows of corn directly in front of me were swaying, just slightly, in a pattern that didn't match the breeze. It was subtle, but I could see the stalks shifting, parting, like something was moving through them. It was coming straight toward me. I scrambled to my feet, my knees stiff from sitting so long, my heart pounding. I held the knife out in front of me, though my hand shook uncontrollably. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped again. I stood there in the open, staring into the dark wall of corn, my breath shallow. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt locked in place. I could see nothing in front of me, only the tall stalks swaying gently as if touched by an unseen hand. Then I heard it, a low, steady breathing. Not mine, not an animal's. Slow and human, coming from only a few feet inside the row. The sound broke me. I turned and ran, my legs finally obeying, the knife clutched tight in my hand. I sprinted across the dirt, my blanket and water bottle forgotten, my flashlight still turned off. The ground was uneven, catching at my feet, but I forced myself forward, my lungs burning. Behind me, I heard the rows of corn thrashing as something moved quickly through them, keeping pace with me. I reached the dirt road that cut between the fields and kept running, my shoes slipping on the loose soil. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. Footsteps pounding the dirt, fast, heavy, closing the distance. I pushed myself harder, legs screaming, until the faint outline of the tree line appeared ahead. I knew if I could just reach it, I could find cover. My chest felt like it was tearing open with each breath, but I kept running. Every nerve in my body focused on escaping. When I finally crossed into the trees, I dove behind the thick trunk of an oak, pressing my back hard against the bark. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to breathe silently. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the field. I waited, trembling, straining to hear through the pounding in my ears. After a few long seconds, I heard the slow, steady breathing again, just beyond the tree line. It lingered, unhurried, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was there. My body shook uncontrollably, my muscles stiff with fear. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the breathing faded. The silence returned. I stayed crouched behind that tree for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. When the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, I finally forced myself to stand. My legs were numb and weak, but I stumbled back toward town, never once looking back at the fields. By the time I reached the edge of the houses, the sun was breaking the horizon, washing everything in dull, pale light. The fields looked harmless again, calm and empty, swaying gently in the morning breeze. But I knew better. I knew what I had heard, what I had nearly seen. I never went back after that night. Couldn't. Even now, when I pass by those fields in the daylight, I feel my chest tighten, my mind flashing back to the silence, the footsteps, the breathing. Whatever was out there waited until midnight to make itself known, and I had been foolish enough to invite it. The fields were silent until midnight, and after that, they were never silent to me again. I remember the first time I stood at the edge of those fields. The land stretched farther than my eyes could follow. An ocean of tall grass broken by patches of darker earth, where the soil had been tilled and left bare. The place had a stillness about it that was hard to describe, like a silence that pressed against your skin. Even in the day when the sun was high and the air smelled of dust and cut weeds, something about it felt heavy. At night that weight doubled. I came there because I had nowhere else to go. I had been moving from town to town, sleeping in my car, staying in cheap motels when I could, and sometimes on open ground when money ran thin. I had no plan, no direction, just miles behind me and more miles ahead. That night I ended up near the fields because the road narrowed and bent away from any sign of light. There was no gas station glow, no farmhouse window shining, nothing but the shape of the land against the dim sky. I pulled my car onto a flat stretch beside the dirt track that cut into the fields. I remember how the dust rose behind me in a soft cloud as I stopped, drifting back in the glow of my brake lights until it thinned into the darkness. I killed the engine and sat for a long while, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the faint hiss of the wind against the grass. It was so quiet. Too quiet. I got out of the car and stretched, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was dry and smelled faintly of earth. The sky was wide, scattered with faint stars that looked weaker than they should have been, like the fields swallowed even the light above them. There were no crickets, no frogs, no night calls from hidden things. Just silence, like the land itself was holding its breath. I told myself it didn't matter. Silence was better than hearing trucks on the highway or drunks stumbling out of a bar. I set up my spot near the car, unrolled the thin sleeping bag I carried, and laid it out on the ground. I ate a cold can of beans straight with a spoon and washed it down with warm water from a plastic jug. I lay back and tried to let myself relax, but I kept staring at the grass swaying under the faint breeze. It moved, but it made no sound. I drifted into uneasy sleep, waking more than once to look around. Each time I opened my eyes, the same picture greeted me. The black outline of grass against the sky, the faint light of stars, the unmoving shape of my car. Hours passed like that, broken by short fits of rest. Then, sometime near midnight, the silence broke. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I had imagined it. A rustle, a quick snap, like a foot pressing on dry stalks. I froze where I lay, staring out at the fields. My ears strained, searching for it again. For a moment there was nothing, just the weight of that quiet pressing down again. Then it came once more, clearer this time and not far away. It was the sound of movement, slow, steady, deliberate. Something was walking through the fields. My heart picked up. I lay flat, barely breathing, my eyes locked on the tall grass. I couldn't see anything. No shape, no figure, just the faint shift of stalks bending in the darkness. But the sound carried closer now, too heavy to be an animal, too measured to be the random shuffle of wind. The steps stopped suddenly. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stared into that wall of grass, every nerve on edge, waiting. Then the sound came again, this time from a different spot, like whatever it was had changed direction. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight I kept near my bag. I held it tight, not turning it on yet, just keeping it ready. My other hand went to the pocket knife in my boot. The blade wasn't much, barely long enough to count for anything, but it was better than nothing. Minutes dragged on like hours. The sound of movement came and went, sometimes near, sometimes far, always hidden behind that curtain of grass. I couldn't tell how many there were. 1, 2? More. The steps never overlapped, but they shifted places, circling, testing. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. But fear worked its way deeper with every second. The fields had been silent all evening, and now, right at midnight, they were alive with something I couldn't see. At some point, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to know. My hand shook as I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it toward the grass. The beam cut through the darkness, white and sharp, spilling across the stalks. They glowed pale and empty, swaying gently, no figure between them. I swept the light side to side, searching, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of grass and dirt. My chest tightened. I killed the light again, afraid of giving myself away, though I already felt seen. Then I heard it. A single step, close, too close. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly toward the sound. And though the night swallowed everything beyond a few feet, I could swear I saw the stalks parting, something low slipping back into the grass. My skin went cold. I couldn't stay out there. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the sleeping roll under my arm, and backed toward the car. My keys rattled in my hand as I unlocked the door and slid inside. I hit the lock button and sat there. The windows rolled up, the dark pressing close around me. The fields were silent again. Dead silent. But I knew I wasn't alone. Time dragged. The clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight, then on into the small hours. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. Just sat there clutching the flashlight and staring out at the shifting shadows beyond the glass. Now and then I thought I saw shapes in the grass. A head rising, then sinking back down. A shoulder vanishing into the stalks. Once I thought I caught the faintest reflection of eyes, but when I blinked it was gone. I waited for dawn. I thought the light would bring relief, that the fields would lose their weight under the sun. But when the sky finally began to pale, the silence still held. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that endless stretch of grass and the feeling that something had been watching me all night. I left as soon as there was enough light to see the road. I didn't eat, didn't pack carefully, just shoved everything in the car and drove, the tires kicking up a trail of dust behind me. I didn't look back, but the memory stayed. Days later, in another town, I read something in a local paper left on a diner counter. A body had been found not far from those fields. A drifter, they said, maybe attacked, maybe robbed, maybe worse. No one had seen who did it. No one heard a thing. The report didn't surprise me. I knew what I had heard. I knew what had walked those fields at midnight, silent until it chose not to be. And I knew I had been lucky. Lucky to leave before that silence swallowed me too. I never went back. But sometimes when I wake in the dark and everything is too quiet, I hear it again. The faint rustle of steps in the grass, steady, patient, waiting. And I know the fields are never really silent. Not at midnight. I grew up around farmland, long stretches of open ground where the corn rose high in summer, and the wheat swayed in the late-season winds. There was nothing unusual about fields to me. They were part of my world, something I saw daily, worked in, and crossed without a second thought. But there was one set of fields a few miles outside the edge of town that never sat right with me. They were just empty, flat land that stretched further than your eyes wanted to follow. But there was something about them that gave me an unease. Even during the day, they felt too still. It wasn't until one summer night that I found out why people avoided that place when the sun went down. The fields were silent all the time, but at midnight, the silence broke in a way I still can't fully explain without feeling that same cold grip of fear creeping back into me. I had been driving home late that evening. I worked long shifts at a warehouse loading and unloading trucks, and my route back cut across the countryside. I usually kept to the main road, but I decided to take the back way, one that shaved off a few minutes. The road ran straight for miles, with the flat farmland stretching on both sides. That night the air was heavy, no breeze at all, the heat from the day still rising up from the blacktop. My windows were rolled down, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the faint hiss of the tires rolling over the pavement. On either side of me, the field sat dark under the faint light of a thin moon. I noticed it after a while, how quiet everything was. Normally, even at night, you'd hear the chirping of crickets, maybe the distant yip of a coyote, frogs from some ditch filled with water. But there was nothing, just my car and the silence pressing in. I thought it was odd, but I kept driving, glancing at the dashboard clock. It was a few minutes before midnight when I felt the need to pull over. I don't know why, but it was like something inside me told me to stop. The road was empty, not a set of headlights in either direction, so I pulled onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence hit harder once the engine stopped. It was like a blanket had been thrown over the world, smothering every trace of sound. I got out of the car, leaving the door open, and stood by the edge of the field. The rows were neat, tilled, and ran straight toward the horizon. I could see the pale outlines of stalks in the moonlight, their edges sharp but motionless. I waited for a breeze to stir them, but the air was dead, heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. I checked my watch. Midnight had just struck. That was when I heard it. It started as a faint sound, so low I thought it was my imagination. A rustling deep in the rows of crops far out, too far to see. It was steady, moving, almost like footsteps dragging through the dirt between the stalks. I froze and listened harder. The noise didn't fade. It grew closer, deliberate, as if someone was walking slowly but surely toward the road. My mouth went dry and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a deer pushing through the rows. But the rhythm was wrong. Too heavy, too even. Every few seconds the rustle would stop, then start again, like someone pausing, then continuing. I strained my eyes against the field, but the moonlight wasn't enough to show me anything more than shadows. Still, the sound was drawing nearer, and I could tell it wasn't random. It was coming directly toward where I stood. I felt the urge to get back in the car, but I couldn't move yet. Something about the steady pace of that sound had me locked in place. The rows ahead of me seemed endless, a tunnel of blackness with no end, but somewhere in there something was pushing closer and closer. Then it stopped again. This time it didn't start back up. I held my breath, waiting, listening so hard my ears ached. The silence stretched out, thicker than before. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then, from maybe 20 feet away inside the rows, something exhaled. A slow, long release of air, low enough to almost sound like a growl, but unmistakably human. I stumbled back toward the car, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I turned the key, but the engine coughed and failed. I tried again, and the same thing happened. Nothing but a dead sputter. My headlights had cut off when I killed the engine earlier, so now I sat in total darkness, the only light being the faint moon above. My eyes darted to the field in front of me. The sound started again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was faster, like someone rushing through the rows, pushing stalks aside, heading right for the road. I panicked, hit the lock button again even though the doors were already locked, and kept twisting the key until the engine finally roared back to life. My headlights snapped on, flooding the edge of the field with harsh white light. There was nothing there. The rows of crops were empty, standing still as if they hadn't been touched. The noise had stopped the instant my lights came on. I didn't waste a second. I floored the gas, tires spitting gravel, and sped down that road as fast as I could. The field stretched on either side, the rows blurring past, but the longer I drove, the more I felt like I wasn't leaving it behind. Like something was keeping pace, hidden just out of sight inside the rows. I kept glancing at the edges of the headlights, half expecting to see someone burst out onto the road. But nothing ever did. When I finally reached the end of the back road and hit the intersection with the main highway, I didn't stop. I turned hard onto the asphalt and kept going until I saw the glow of town lights ahead. Only then did I slow down. By the time I got home, my hands still shook, and the silence of those fields clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake off. For days after, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I had been overtired. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But the memory of that breath, that deliberate sound of someone exhaling only a few feet away, wouldn't leave me. I avoided that road after that, took the long way every time. I never told anyone because I knew how it would sound, like some made-up story. But I knew what I heard, And I knew the fields were never empty like they looked. Weeks later, I found out I wasn't the only one. There had been reports over the years, whispered stories of people pulling over around midnight and hearing movement in the fields. Some said they saw figures standing just inside the rows. Others claimed they'd chased noises only to find nothing but untouched crops. Nobody had proof, just stories. Farmers said they avoided working too late because the land gave them a bad feeling. The way the sound carried at night didn't match anything they knew. I didn't go back. I couldn't. But I kept thinking about it. How silent it had been until the exact moment midnight struck. It was too exact, too precise to be a coincidence. Something used that time, whether it was someone out there or something else. Something explainable but hidden. I still don't know who or what was moving through those rows, but I do know this. The fields weren't silent after midnight. And if you ever find yourself out there, standing at the edge when the clock hits 12, you'll hear it too. The steady steps drawing closer, the breath waiting just beyond your sight. And once you do, you won't mistake it for your imagination. You'll know it's real. That night left me with a simple truth I can't shake. Fields don't stay silent forever. Midnight they wake, and whatever walks between those rows is real enough to follow you home. I grew up around farmland, and the kind of quiet you hear in open fields at night always felt normal to me. You hear a little wind moving through the tall grass, sometimes the faint chirping of crickets or a far-off bark from a farm dog, but for the most part, it's just silence and space. I never thought that kind of silence could feel threatening, until one night when I was out there alone, miles from anyone else, and the fields didn't stay quiet the way they should have. I had been working long hours during harvest season. The farm I was helping with sat on the edge of a wide stretch of fields that rolled out flat in every direction. During the day it felt endless. Rows of dried corn swaying in the wind, patches of overgrown grass and dirt tracks that wound through like veins. At night it changed into something else entirely. The openness that seemed freeing in daylight turned heavy, like the darkness could swallow you up if you wandered too far. That evening I stayed late to finish clearing some equipment left near the edge of one of the farthest fields. The sun had already dropped below the tree line, leaving only a band of orange that slowly faded into gray. By the time I started walking back along the dirt road, the air had gone cool, and the first stars were beginning to show. The farmhouse where I was staying was at least a mile away, but from where I stood I could only see a faint outline of its roof, a shadow against the dim sky. The fields around me were so still it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Even the insects seemed quiet, which was unusual for that time of year. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat in my head. I told myself it was just exhaustion making me uneasy, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the thought that something about the night felt heavier than normal. I reached a clearing where the dirt road split. To the right it led toward the farmhouse. To the left it cut deeper into the fields, winding toward an abandoned barn that hadn't been used in years. I knew better than to waste time near that barn at night. Everyone in the area avoided it. It wasn't because of stories or superstition, just plain common sense. Old structures out in the fields like that were unstable, full of holes in the floor, nests of animals, maybe worse. But even knowing that, my eyes kept drifting toward it. Something in that direction looked darker than it should have been, like the shadows there weren't just from the night. I forced myself to stay on the road toward the farmhouse. The silence stretched with every step I took. At one point I stopped walking, just to listen, and the stillness around me felt so thick it was like standing underwater. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, carrying low over the fields. A sound that didn't belong. I thought maybe it was the distant hum of a machine. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It was a slow, steady rustling, moving through the stalks of dried corn in uneven waves. The kind of sound that only comes when something alive pushes its way through. It wasn't the wind, there wasn't any. The air was completely still. The noise would start, drag along for a few seconds, then stop suddenly, leaving the silence even heavier than before. I turned toward the direction it came from, straining my eyes, but all I could see were rows of black shapes, the tall stalks swaying just barely as if something had brushed against them. My stomach tightened. I stood frozen for a moment, telling myself it was probably a deer. That would have been the simple answer. Out here they wandered all the time. But something in the rhythm of the movement felt wrong. A deer moves quickly, bounding and leaping through, not in slow starts and stops like this. I picked up my pace toward the farmhouse. Every few steps I glanced back, expecting to see something step out onto the dirt road, but nothing did. For a while the sound faded, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then, closer this time, the rustling returned. It was to my left now, keeping pace with me. I kept walking faster and faster, my boots crunching against the gravel. The noise in the field matched my pace, pushing through stalks and dry weeds in uneven bursts, pausing whenever I paused. My skin crawled. It was following me. The farmhouse lights were still too far away to feel like any kind of safety. The road stretched endlessly ahead. Thought about running, but if I did, I knew the noise would only chase me harder, and in the dark fields I wouldn't stand a chance if whatever it was decided to come closer. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, though my body screamed at me to sprint. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped completely. I walked a few more steps, then stopped too. Nothing. No rustling, no movement, not even the faintest shift of grass. Just the empty silence again. The air was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I stayed still for a long minute waiting, but nothing came. I started walking again, this time slower, every step careful. When I finally looked back, I thought I saw something between the rows. Not a clear shape, just the faint suggestion of a figure standing motionless among the stalks, darker than the rest of the night. I blinked, and it was gone. I reached the farmhouse without running, though it took everything in me not to. Once inside, I locked the door, shut the windows, and stood in the dark kitchen with my back against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe just an animal, maybe my eyes playing tricks. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old house making me flinch. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not the rustling this time, but something sharper. A scrape against the side of the house, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded. I stayed frozen, listening as the sound dragged along the wall, pausing, then moving again. Whatever had been in the fields was here now, outside. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The scrape circled the house, dragging along the wood siding until it stopped near the back door. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours, until finally exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, when I went outside, I saw the marks. Long, shallow scrapes carved into the wood, too high off the ground to be from any animal I knew. They stretched along the side of the house, stopping right where the back door was. I never saw anything in the fields that clear again, but the silence always came back at night. The fields would hold perfectly still, no wind, no insects, nothing, until just around midnight. Then the rustling would start again, moving through the stalks, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always there, waiting. I learned to stay inside after dark. I never went back near that barn, and I never let myself stand too long on the road at night. The silence in those fields wasn't empty. It was full of something that knew how to move without being seen, something that followed, something that waited until midnight to remind me it was still there. And the worst part was knowing it wasn't gone. It never went away. It was still out there every night, silent until the clock struck 12. And then the fields would wake up with the sound of something moving where nothing should be. I had driven past those fields more times than I could count. They stretched for miles, flat and empty. Nothing but tall corn and wheat that swayed with the wind. During the day, they looked harmless, golden under the sun, the kind of view you might see in a calendar picture. At night, though, it was a different world. The land opened up wide under the sky, and the stalks of corn stood like endless walls on both sides of the road. There were no houses close by, no lights in the distance, nothing but the dark rows of crops and the narrow road cutting straight through them. I had always thought the silence out there was the strangest thing. Even when the wind blew, it never seemed to sound the same as other places. It was heavier, like the field swallowed up noise instead of carrying it. I didn't think much of it until the night I decided to park out there and stay for a while. It was late September, and the air had a sharp edge. I had been restless all day, couldn't sit still, couldn't sleep. I took my truck out for a drive just to calm myself down. The town was quiet, most people already inside by 10. I passed the gas station, closed for the night, and then found myself on the long road that cut through the fields. I pulled over on the gravel shoulder, left the engine off, and sat there with the windows down. At first it was peaceful. The only sound was the ticking of the engine cooling down, and a faint breeze moving through the stalks. I leaned back, watching the sky. The stars out there were so sharp and clear it almost hurt to look at them. The moon was a thin slice low on the horizon. For a while I thought maybe this was all I needed. Just some quiet air, a place to clear my head. But then I noticed it. The silence wasn't normal. Out in the country you usually hear something, crickets, frogs, even coyotes far away. But here nothing, not a single sound came from those fields. It was like everything living in them had packed up and left. I sat there waiting, telling myself maybe the cool air had driven them deeper into the stalks, or maybe it wasn't the right time of night. But the silence pressed down harder the longer I sat. It was around midnight when I finally heard something. At first it was faint, like a distant shuffle. I leaned forward, straining to catch it. It grew clearer, not steady but broken, like steps in dry grass. I froze, staring into the dark rows of corn. I couldn't see much, only the black shape of the plants moving slightly in the wind. The sound would stop, then start again, always from a different spot. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or raccoons moving through. But the steps didn't sound like that. They had weight. They sounded deliberate. I kept still for as long as I could, my hands gripping the wheel even though the engine was off. Then, without thinking, I reached for my flashlight on the passenger seat. I turned it on and aimed it straight into the corn. The light cut through the first few rows but didn't show much. Just stalks and leaves bending under the beam. The sound had stopped the moment I clicked it on. My ears rang from the sudden quiet, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. After a while I turned the light off and sat in the dark again. A few minutes passed before the noise returned. Same thing, slow steps, then a pause, then steps again. This time they sounded closer. I felt my stomach knotting. I didn't want to sit there anymore, but I also didn't want to start the truck and make a scene. I waited, telling myself to be calm, telling myself it was nothing. But the sound went on, moving around, always just out of sight. By 12:30 I couldn't take it anymore. I started the engine. The noise stopped instantly, like whoever or whatever was making it had been listening for me too. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road, my headlights catching the edges of the corn. I should have gone home. That would have been the smart thing. But as I drove down the empty road, something inside me twisted. I needed to know. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was just plain fear eating at me. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. By the time I reached the end of the road, I had already turned around. I parked again, this time a little farther down, killed the lights, and sat in the dark. The field stood silent once more, waiting. The sound didn't start right away. I sat there for nearly an hour, fighting off the heavy pull of sleep, every muscle tight. At one point I thought about getting out and walking into the field, but the thought alone made my throat go dry. The idea of being surrounded by those tall stalks, not seeing anything around me, was too much. So I stayed put, eyes on the rows in front of me. Then right at midnight the sound returned. It was louder this time. Not one set of steps, but several, scattered across the field. Some near, some farther back. They weren't in rhythm, but they were all moving, breaking stalks, crunching the dry ground beneath. I couldn't breathe right. My chest felt locked. I flicked the flashlight on again, shining it hard into the rows. Nothing. The light hit the plants and stopped. No shapes, no animals, nothing but the whisper of the corn moving. But the sounds kept going, just outside the reach of the beam. I realized then that whoever was out there knew exactly where I was. They were staying just far enough back not to be seen, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. The thought made my skin crawl. I slammed the truck into drive and pulled away fast, gravel spitting out behind me. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the field shrinking in the rearview mirror. For days I couldn't shake it. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But the silence in those fields, the steps that started only after midnight, haunted me. I found myself driving out there again, against my better judgment, trying to make sense of it. Each time it was the same, dead silence until midnight. Then the noises would start, slow and careful, like something was watching me from every direction. The last night I went, I forced myself to stay longer. I wanted proof. I brought a camera, hoping to catch something. Midnight came, and so did the sounds. They moved closer than ever before, so close I could hear the sharp snap of stalks breaking under weight. My hands shook as I lifted the camera and snapped pictures into the dark. The flash lit up the first rows of corn but showed nothing beyond them. Then, without warning, the sound of running burst from the field, heavy, fast, coming straight toward the road. My heart stopped. I threw the truck in gear and floored it. In the mirror, I saw the rows shaking violently, like something massive was charging through them. But nothing ever broke out onto the road. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, parked under a streetlight with my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. The next morning I checked the camera. Every picture showed the same thing, empty stalks, shadows, nothing more. But I knew what I had heard. I knew someone had been out there, hiding in those fields, moving only after midnight. I never went back. To this day, when I drive by, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my windows rolled up tight. The fields are still silent in the daytime, still golden and calm, but I know what waits in them when the clock strikes 12. And I know that silence isn't peace. It's something watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to move again. That was the last time I let myself linger on that road. Whatever is out there is real, and it isn't the wind or animals. It's people. People who wait in the dark fields until midnight, moving where no one can see them, waiting for someone foolish enough to stop and listen too long. And I was lucky I drove away when I did, because I'm certain if I had waited a little longer, those steps wouldn't have stayed in the fields. They would have crossed the road. They would have come for me. I grew up around fields. Not the small garden plots most people picture, but wide stretches of farmland that rolled out flat and endless, the kind that made the horizon look like it went on forever. The air always smelled of cut hay and dirt when the wind shifted right, and during the summer the crickets would sing so loud you could almost forget how empty it all really was. Out there after the sun went down, silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a weight. It pressed on your chest, sank into your skin, and reminded you how far you were from the safety of people, lights, and the noise of a town. I didn't think much about that weight until one summer night, when I agreed to stay at my uncle's property while he was out of state. He owned close to 60 acres of farmland, most of it used for corn and a few patches of wheat, but a good portion of it was just open grass fields that hadn't been worked in years. He had a small farmhouse on one corner of the land, and a couple of sheds closer to the middle. It wasn't exactly isolated. There was a highway about 3 miles out and another farmhouse, a little over a mile away, but once you were in the middle of those fields, it felt like you were standing at the edge of the earth. He asked me to check on the property for a few nights, feed his dog, and make sure no one tried to mess with his equipment. People sometimes cut through farmland out there, and more than once he had dealt with strangers poking around. It was supposed to be simple, a favor, something I didn't think twice about. The first night passed without much thought. I fed the dog, made a lap around the sheds with a flashlight, and then sat on the porch with a beer listening to cicadas until I got tired. I locked up and went to bed. The dog curled in the corner of the room like a warm rug. The second night was different. The evening started the same, but by the time the sun dropped behind the horizon, the air felt heavy in a way that didn't sit right. Usually the fields buzzed with insects, croaked with frogs, or at least carried the distant bark of a dog from another farm. That night there was nothing. The fields were silent. The kind of silent where you can hear your own breathing too loud. The kind of silent that makes you turn your head for no reason, just to make sure you're still alone. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself maybe the weather had shifted. Maybe it was about to rain. Or maybe I was just noticing it more because I was by myself. I fed the dog again, walked out past the sheds with the flashlight, and came back with nothing unusual to report. Still, that silence hung thick. I didn't like it. I told myself I'd stay up later just to keep an eye on things. The dog didn't seem bothered, stretched out on the porch like he had no concerns at all. I sat in the chair, drank another beer, and kept scanning the fields. Every now and then I thought I caught a flicker of something moving far out, where the grass grew tall. But when I focused the light, there was nothing. Just empty stalks swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. By midnight, the silence broke. It started faint, like a rustling too far away to matter, then sharper, deliberate. Something moved out there. At first I thought it might be deer. They cut through farmland often, slipping through fences to graze. I even wanted it to be deer, but the longer I listened, the less it sounded like hooves and more like footsteps. Heavy ones, pausing between each set, then starting again. The dog finally noticed. His ears pricked, head up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He didn't bark, which made me uneasy. Dogs bark when they're curious or want to scare something off. They growl when they're sure there's something out there, something that doesn't belong. I shined the flashlight across the field, slow and steady, trying not to rush. The beam cut across the grass, swept over the sheds, then slid into the far rows of corn. I thought I saw a shape then, just for a moment. It was tall enough to stand above the grass, too narrow to be livestock. It moved when I moved the light, slipping out of the beam as if it didn't want to be seen. My throat went dry. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I had caught the trunk of a tree or the angle of the shed wrong, but then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Slow, careful, like someone didn't want to be noticed but wasn't trying hard enough to hide. I stood up, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, my other hand sliding down to the knife I carried in my pocket. It wasn't much, just a folding blade I used for opening boxes and cutting rope. But it felt better than nothing. I aimed the beam across the field again. Nothing. Only rows of grass and corn stretching into darkness. The dog growled louder, stepping off the porch like he was ready to bolt into the field. I whistled low to keep him close. I didn't want him running out there and disappearing into the dark. If something was moving, I wasn't about to let him chase it down. I waited, listened. The silence pressed harder than before, then came the sound again. Crunch, shift, pause. It wasn't constant like walking. More like moving a few steps, stopping, then moving again. I couldn't tell how far it was anymore. Out in the fields at night, distance is tricky. A sound can feel close enough to touch and still be 100 yards away. I told myself it was just trespassers, maybe kids looking to mess around. But the thing that unsettled me was the timing. Nothing happened until midnight. Almost like whoever was out there had been waiting for the house to go dark before they started moving. I stayed on the porch until my nerves felt raw. My watch ticked past 1, then closer to 2, and eventually the silence returned. No more steps, no more rustling. Even the dog settled back down, though he didn't stretch out the way he had before. He stayed curled, ears twitching like he was still listening for it. I barely slept that night. Every sound the house made felt like a warning. The creak of the wood, the wind against the shutters, the ticking of the clock. When the sun came up, I walked the fields, checked for signs of trespassers, but the grass looked untouched. No broken stalks, no footprints, nothing disturbed. The third night, I thought about leaving. I told myself I'd call my uncle, tell him something felt wrong and I couldn't stay. But then I thought about how stupid it would sound. Telling a grown man I couldn't stay on a farm because I heard footsteps in the dark? He'd laugh, tell me it was deer or the neighbor's kids cutting through. So I convinced myself to stay. The silence came again that night, dead stillness wrapping the fields as soon as the sun dipped. I tried to keep busy, kept the lights on in the house longer, but by midnight the same sound returned. Footsteps in the grass closer than before. This time I didn't sit on the porch. I slipped inside, turned off the lights, and cracked the curtain just enough to watch. The flashlight sat on the table beside me, but I didn't pick it up. I thought if I stayed dark, maybe I'd see more without giving myself away. It took about 20 minutes before I caught it. Movement. Out by the edge of the shed, something shifted. A shadow where it shouldn't be. My eyes strained against the dark, trying to make sense of the shape. It wasn't an animal, it was a man. He stood still, half hidden by the corner of the shed, head tilted toward the house. I couldn't see his face, couldn't even make out his clothes, but I knew the shape of a human when I saw one. My stomach dropped. He didn't move for the longest time, just stood there watching. When he finally shifted, it wasn't random. He didn't wander off. He stepped carefully, slow, making his way along the shed like he was circling closer. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, the dog stiff at my feet, trembling with a low growl he didn't release. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. The man disappeared into the dark behind the shed, and I waited for him to reappear on the other side. Minutes passed. Nothing. I checked the back window, then the side, every corner of the house, but he never showed again. I stayed awake until sunrise, gripping the knife, jumping at every noise. The next morning I searched again, walked around the sheds, checked the ground, but like before there were no signs. No footprints, no broken locks, no disturbed grass. Nothing to prove what I saw, but I knew I had seen him. By the fourth night I didn't want to be there at all. Every instinct screamed to leave, to call someone, but pride or stupidity kept me. I told myself one more night. Just one more, and then I'd tell my uncle I couldn't do it. The silence came like a curtain dropping. At midnight, the steps returned. Not far this time, close. Too close. They circled the house. I heard the crunch of grass, the pause beneath the window. I didn't look out this time. I didn't want to see him looking back in. The dog pressed against my leg, whining low, body rigid. I clutched the knife until my hand cramped. The footsteps circled again, slow, deliberate, then stopped at the back door. The handle rattled. I froze, every muscle locking, breath stuck in my chest. The metal shook gently, testing. Not forcing, not breaking, just checking. Then it stopped. I waited in that darkness for hours, ears straining, every sound magnified. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under, but it wasn't real sleep. It was restless, thin, broken by the slightest creak. When morning came, the back door showed faint smudges on the handle. Nothing else. I didn't last another night. I packed my things, locked up, and left. My uncle wasn't happy when I told him I couldn't stay, but I didn't care. I never went back.